Hello, and welcome to the Cape Coffee Beans podcast. My name is Faden, and I'm the founder of Cape Coffee Beans, South Africa's leading retailer in the specialty coffee space. We sell everything you need to make an amazing cup of coffee at home, at the office, in the cafe, or even on the road, including equipment, accessories, and artisan roasted coffee beans, both online and in-store at our headquarters in Claremont, Cape Town. This podcast is a deep dive into the world of South African specialty coffee, with a focus on the brands, the businesses, and the people in the local coffee scene, many of whom I'm privileged to work with. I'll be bringing you interviews with many of these South African coffee heroes, so please do subscribe to the podcast and share it with your coffee-loving friends. Thank you for your support. Now let's get to today's episode. This episode of the Cape Coffee Beans podcast was a pretty exciting one for me to record. It had actually been quite a while since our last podcast release episode, but the occasion for the new episode is what made it particularly exciting. This episode is an introduction to Cedar Coffee Roasters, which is the first new coffee brand that we've brought on board for several years. I have never had the intention with Cape Coffee Beans of stocking everyone's coffee, or even the widest selection of coffee necessarily. My ambition has always been to stock the best, to work with the best roasters in South Africa, or at least in the Cape Town area for now, and to make their stuff available to the whole country and beyond. And Cedar is the first brand that I've come across in some time where I've really felt that these guys belong on our platform. Now, I've worked with Winston Leigh, the guys behind Cedar Coffee Roasters, before in other capacities, which you can hear about in this episode, but their coffee speaks for itself. It has been really fantastic. I've really enjoyed trying their new coffees, and I feel very confident that they're going to be a great addition to Cape Coffee Beans. So, if you'd like to learn a little bit more about Winston Leigh and Cedar Coffee Roasters, please tune in for this episode. Leigh, Winston, welcome to the Cape Coffee Beans podcast. I should actually start by saying welcome back to Winston, a second-time guest. Winston, it's good to have you back.
Thanks, Faden. Good to be back.
And Leigh, you are a first-time guest, though potentially overdue because we've worked together for a long time. Welcome to the Cape Coffee Beans podcast.
Thanks for having me, man. It's a pleasure to be here.
So the reason you guys are on the podcast today is because you have a new roasting business and a new brand of coffee that Cape Coffee Beans is proudly working with, Cedar. And the main reason for this podcast is we want to introduce the people who listen to the podcast to the Cedar brand and what you guys are doing. But before we do that, I do always like to dive a little bit into the background of the people behind the coffee brands that we work with. Now, Winston already has had a whole episode to himself. And if anybody's interested in re-listening to that, that was episode number 9, which you can go and find, and you can hear a little bit more about Winston. But I'd love to start to introduce Leigh a little bit more to the people listening to the podcast. So Leigh, we're going to start with you. Please, would you give the listeners just a little bit of context on your personal background? Forget the coffee stuff. Let's just talk about where do you come from? What were you doing before all this coffee stuff happened?
Cool. So, born and bred in Cape Town. Actually stayed in Heideveld. Kind of grew up in Heideveld and then moved to Thornton. I've always had this, idea of actually working in e-commerce. I did my degree at UWC, finished my BCom degree, but we always know that if you're doing anything that's BCom general, chances are you don't really know what you want to do after that. So one of the passions I always had was to actually own something to own something for myself, something that could give back. I didn't know what that would be at the time, and coffee wasn't something that I was really thinking of when I started studying. But then what normally happened is I would normally take trips to town, and I think that's when I started seeing a lot of coffee shops, and I remember going to Origin at the time and a few other shops, Truth, and I think just the minute I actually tasted a good cup of coffee, I was like, wow, this is like something really amazing. And what I thought was, I never really took it as a career, but at the time, that's the only interest I had. I enjoyed it as a hobby. And when I actually finished my degree, the one thing I said was that, cool, if I don't know what I'm wanting to do within my career, the one thing I do want to do is learn a little bit more about coffee. So I
Okay.
didn't necessarily know where I would have to start myself in. I just wanted to learn about making flat whites and pouring nice latte art. I didn't know anything. So I did what everyone else seemed to be doing, and that would be to apply for a home barista course at the time, Origin,
Okay.
where I met Bilbo, a very lovely lady, and she just taught me the basics of coffee. And then I was like, oh, you know what? I'm also here to try to get a job. And at the time, she was like, it was quite full, but she did offer me advice to go to either Espresso Lab or Rosetta. I was like, I have no idea who these people are, but thank you. And then I somehow found a post on Twitter, and it was to be either a driver or a barista shift at Rosetta. So I was like, okay, cool. I really don't want to drive, but I do want to work in coffee. So I applied and I had an interview with Rob at the time. I told him, look, I have no experience. I literally just want to learn. And he said, well, I can teach you everything you need to know about coffee, but I needed to do our deliveries. And this was part-time work that I've actually done for him. So what would happen is I would deliver coffee Tuesdays and Fridays, and I would get the chance to make coffee with Ollie at the market. And this was 7 years ago. So at the market, we used to do slow brew, and that's kind of how I got into it. So I would always be invited to cup-ins, tasting coffee, and just like one of the things with Rosetta was that they were very big on teaching and learning, and I think I've benefited a lot from that. And working at the market, I actually looked over to the far end and I saw Origin. I was like, there's another guy that's in coffee and he's colored like me. And that was actually Winston. And that's the first time I actually met Winston without actually knowing him at all. So yeah, that is basically how I started.
And this was 2015, is that right? So around then that you started with Rosetta.
Yeah.
I think we also need to give a shout out to Bilbo, because I also did that same home barista course long time ago. Feels like it's a common part of a lot of people's stories. You as well, Winston?
I did the 3-day course with Bilbo, so
Right.
Thank you very much.
Right.
Bilbo.
Thank you, Bilbo, from all of us. Yeah.
Shaping the future of coffee.
There you go.
I would say that the guy that actually sparked my love for coffee was actually Michael McDonald. He was at the brew bar at the time, and he was the guy that actually made me a coffee that like really blew my socks off and made me want to actually venture into this. So yeah, thanks to Mike. There's actually a lot of people to thank for our journey in coffee.
Sure. Mike definitely deserves a shout out as well. I spent a lot of time listening to and learning from Mike in the early days. And Mike, of course, introduced me to Winston sometime around that same time period as well. So Leigh, you started delivering for Rosetta, and I guess you and I probably met sometime around then. I used to hang out at Rosetta because we weren't doing much business at the time, so I got to just hang out and drink coffee and ask lots of questions. But you and I probably met at that time. But I do remember you kind of getting behind the bar not too long after that, right? I mean, when did that happen?
So I think at the time I was delivering just under a year, and I remember sending Jono and Rob an email to say, hey dude, I really want to get behind the bar. Is there anything that I could do to actually push myself? And they were like, cool. At the time, I think one of the guys were actually leaving, and then I got an opportunity to work part-time as a part-time barista. Then that moved to full-time, and then I became cafe manager, and then we swapped roles and I became roastery manager, and then I started roasting. And then when I went back down to actually being again a cafe manager. So I think I've went through the levels over my 7 years at Rosetta. So that was fun. I mean, I've learned so many traits and skills through that whole chain.
Sure. Well, I'm sure we would all agree that Rosetta is definitely one of the great places to learn about specialty coffee in South Africa, right? I mean, definitely hold a very high standard. We've had those guys on the podcast as well, and obviously are very proud to work with them too. So that must have been a great place to learn about coffee. And so around the same time, or for a lot of that time, Winston was at Origin coming up there. Let's fast forward to recent times and talk about how Cedar got started. So Leigh, maybe you can kick us off. How did you guys come to start Cedar?
Well, I think Cedar itself, the name came very late on, but one of the things we've always, as our relationship grew, well, between myself and Winston, we always had this idea that if we ever had to start anything, we'd want to work together, just because I think we're very like-minded people. And it's cool to see that we've actually been through this journey over 7 years together, even though we've never worked together. I think we worked for like 3 months at Zeta once. Yeah, 3 months. But other than that, it was just about having the same passion, but the same interests, and knowing that if we had to do something together, it would be eye-opening and like really take the specialty industry by storm. And I think that's what we found out as we've started. It was the thing of like, oh, so who you actually working with? And it's like, when I said Winston, it's like, makes sense that you guys are working together. And I think that was really cool to hear from the coffee community and just people that know us from like customers that we've interacted with. So yeah, so Cedar started as an idea over at the end of 2019?
2020.
2020.
The year that wasn't there, the year that didn't really exist.
Yeah. And then we actually just, we went away to camp. And that's kind of where we started thinking like seriously about starting this. And then, yeah, we spent most of the time at my house in Thornton under the name, under Cedar Road, just plotting and planning and thinking of different ways as to like how we could actually bring this brand to life and not let it be something that's found as a cafe or typical roastery.
And I should clarify for the people listening right now that there is not a cafe on Cedar Road before people get in their cars and head to Thornton. You guys, and you guys aren't running a cafe at this stage, right? But you're based out of Woodstock, is that right?
Yeah, sometimes it feels like a cafe, to be honest, but it's not a cafe, folks.
Okay.
Yeah, I think from my side, like Leigh said, I think I've always been doing a lot of different stuff in the back end. And I said to Leigh before, I said, Leigh, if I ever start a roastery or if ever we get a chance, like I'm coming straight to you. Because I never roasted coffee. I think as much as I've been quite dynamic in what I've done in coffee, roasting is something I've never done before. And Leigh was roasting. And like he said, we've got a lot of similarities and the way that we see coffee in the industry. And we just had the conversation and yeah, we have a third individual who's joined us on the team, who kind of just works in the back end quite a bit. And we had mutual conversations about it and the idea came about. And I think Leigh and I then had a lot of conversations about, do we want to do it? How do we want to do it? Would it work? And then I think we just got excited from that point, because I think this might be a question that you're going to ask us a little bit later, but I think we're unique in the sense that we started off, like Leigh said, as baristas 2014, 2015. And we didn't get into coffee because we wanted to have a roasting business. We got into coffee because we just like coffee. And we started, Leigh as a driver and me as a trainee barista at Origin, because we just love coffee. And I think if we fast forward 8 years later to start Cedar, I think that gives us a sort of a very unique background when it comes to owning a coffee roastery compared to most of the roasteries that are kind of around, which we have a lot to thank for, though,
Definitely.
And I think this gives us the opportunity to take our kind of insights, the way that we see coffee, our experiences, and start something of our own, which we believe would hopefully be a unique business and a unique coffee offering, as we grow.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, one of the things that I hear in common in your story a little bit as well is that I think you both were kind of attracted to the cafe spaces in Cape Town as well, right? Early on in the journey. Because I remember Winston talking about that as well. And obviously visiting the guys who were there at the beginning of specialty coffee at Cape Town, whatever you date that as. So that is interesting. That's a common part of your story. Now, I do have to ask one thing though, as you describe this camping trip where you were thinking about the beginnings of Cedar. One thing that I can't help but wonder is you were saying this was at the end of 2020, right? So we're in heavy lockdown or just coming out of heavy lockdown or going back into heavy lockdown. I can't remember, but that was a really difficult time to be a coffee roaster. I'm sure that all the other guys who we've had on the podcast would say. How did you guys think about that challenge, right? Like what a time to be thinking about setting up another coffee roastery.
Well, I think you don't know. Like for us, we wouldn't know because we don't own a roastery. So I think ignorance is bliss. But at the same time, when we thought about it, we did take COVID into consideration. And I mean, I've been working in the roastery for quite a long time. And one of the things we could still do, even though we went through a hard lockdown, is to sell coffee to people because it was classified under essential services as it's a consumable good. So, and that's one of the reasons we decided to make it a roastery instead of a coffee shop, because I think we didn't want to be reliant on foot traffic. And everything has been moved to virtual, like everything's online, everything is more convenient from at a click of a button. So yeah, so we thought we just wanted to focus on the product itself and getting it to our customers in their homes. And I think that's something that's become very important, and it's the new trend is people actually taking control of their own brewing. So we see a lot of value in helping people and guiding people on their journey in the specialty coffee industry.
I think it's also like just a lot of risk and like equal amounts of faith that things are going to get better in the coffee space. I mean, if you were to start a roastery midway through lockdown in 2020, that wouldn't have been a good idea because things were all over the place. And I think the discussion started around 2020 in the end. And by no means were we then planning on actually starting it, but we were just like, you know what, let's try and plan this and see if we can give this a go, depending on what happens with COVID, because we know at some point we need to get out of the end of this thing. But also because I think a big benefit we have is our collective 14, 16 years experience in coffee before starting a roastery, because most of the roasteries I know were started by folks who wanted to start a coffee business because they're turning the hobby into a business. And in a lot of cases, it started as a small project on the side and eventually grows into a fully fledged business. Whereas for Leigh and I think we come with all of this knowledge and experience in the coffee industry. So I think we had I think we were a bit more prepared, not so much for the business side of things, because that we kind of learning as we're going along. But I think in terms of the market, in terms of having the contacts, having the network, like Leigh said, a lot of our old customers from Origin and Rosetta and people we've met working in coffee, we're extremely excited to hear that we're starting a roastery. So I think we had the benefit of not being sort of an unknown entity, and the fact that we built it up a little bit. So we started selling sort of white labeled, unbranded coffee. In the beginning, it was this kind of underground thing. And the talk was going around that, oh, Winston and Leigh are starting a coffee roastery. So there was a lot of like this mysterious element behind that and a lot of anticipation. And so we just needed to get the product right. And I think because we're relatively young, right? I think 31 and 29, to some we are still very young, to others we are quite old. But I think we've got a lot of energy. I think we've got our ears to the ground in terms of what's happening in the industry, just by like being really active at events, listening to podcasts and trying things that I think a lot of established roasteries might not have the time or can't take the risk to try, here we are, and we giving it a go.
That makes a lot of sense. And I hadn't thought about that I've obviously had the privilege of interviewing and working with a lot of the guys that have started some of the more famous specialty coffee brands in Cape Town. And you're absolutely right that almost all of them went from hobbyist to business owner, right? Not many of them spent a lot of time working at other specialty cafes. I mean, to be fair, they didn't really exist when some of these guys started their businesses, right? So I guess you guys kind of belong to a different generation and are able to take the learnings from those businesses that generation of business owners built.
Yeah, I think we only have them to thank, because I mean, everyone has their own ideas, their own philosophies, and I think for the bulk of the time I worked at Origin and the short time I spent at Rosetta, and I think Leigh can say the same with his time at Rosetta. We stayed there for as long as we did because we loved the places, but you can't help but form your own ideas about, oh wow, I wonder if we could do, if I had my own way, or if I could do it myself, how would I do it? Like, oh, this is really cool. Like, but because you're a barista behind the bar, you have all of these amazing ideas. But I think the wiser business owners and our bosses at the time would obviously be like, listen, guys, once you understand what's happening in the back end, in the spreadsheets, like all these ideas aren't as realistic as what the baristas might think. But I think, we've wisened up quite a bit, but because of what we got to experience working for those amazing companies, we now get the opportunity to kind of do our own version of things.
Yeah, no, I think it's a combination of all the experience that we've learned and now all the ideas that we have. So I would also say that it is in a way a passion project. So this is like the end outcome. And we excited about how what we want to offer the industry itself. And I think a lot of that has to do with or is rooted from our community and the people that we spend our days, or customers, and then again like family that we're always surrounded by. And I think that's something that really makes Cedar, makes it a little bit unique in a way, that we both come from backgrounds that is not very familiar with specialty coffee itself. So yes, we've been serving coffee for 7 years to people that's wisened up about flat whites, but there's times when we come home and the only coffee that they will be drinking is instant coffee. It's like your coffee and like maybe 3 sugars at the time. And I mean that's basically how I started in coffee as well, like 3 sugars, to a point where I was like, if I had to start a coffee shop, I want to be calling it 3 sugars, because that's the way coffee should be drank. So something that we really want to do as Cedar is to actually guide the people that we know and to like influence our own community and our families to actually drink specialty coffee, or at least dabble in the thought of taking this journey with us.
And where do you think that takes you guys? I mean, I'm sure you do a little bit of the kind of daydreaming about the future, or even projecting what the future might look like. Where is Cedar 5 years from now, 10 years from now? What is the ambition?
Yeah, I think if we're talking about the sky being the limit, I think we really want to be recognized as a African coffee roastery. Obviously South African, but I say African specifically because I mean, African countries are generally, in coffee terms, are generally seen as the producing country. And South Africa has this weird dynamic where we're not a producing country, we're a consuming country, semi-producing. I mean, coffee farms in South Africa seem to be on the rise, but we're a consuming country with the economy of a producing country. But I think for anybody that knows the roasters that have been on this podcast before and have also traveled abroad, I said to someone today, I said, I'm not punting Rosetta here, but I literally said to someone today, I said, did you know that the coffee that you can get at Rosetta is as good as any coffee you can find in any of the major cities in the world? It's a world class, and people here don't realize that. And I think for Cedar, we really want to establish ourselves globally as an African coffee roaster. there's a big trend now where a lot of cafes around the world do multi-roaster servings on the bar. So they've got 2 grinders. One is, if it's a cafe in North Carolina, they've got a local roaster, but then they've also got a roaster from Tokyo. And in London, they've got a local roaster, and in the second hopper, there's a roaster from Melbourne. That's sort of the guest coffee. And I could never understand why South African roasters wouldn't feature in this way. And I think that's one of the things we really want to do, is to have a sort of African voice in coffee as a roaster. And I mean, it's not that no roaster has done this before. I think we really just want to actively pursue that and speak up for Africa from a roaster's perspective, or a roasting business's perspective. Look, these are the things we have planned for 5 to 10 years. And I think we've got all the other ambitions of working directly with African producers and all of that kind of stuff. But I think we want to try and do it in a smart way. I think many people have tried. I think when I was a barista, I had the ambitions of doing direct trade coffee. And that was like the answer to serving great specialty. But I think we really want to try and build relationships, because there's the frustration, which I think every roaster has, with why do our African coffees have to leave the continent, and then we have to pay for the coffee and pay for it to come back here, but get a lot less per cup than what our European, Asian and American counterparts do. And I think we actively want to try and not solve that problem, but we want to try not to have to go that route. And I can't elaborate that much more about it for now, but let's just say that in the back end, we're working really hard to try and find another way.
And that is basically where we want to be in 5 to 10 years. But at the same time, we still want to be able to cater to our local markets, because especially now, I think that's like the main focus is we've been locked down. There's tourists coming in, but we don't want to be so reliant on just tourists. We want to be able to serve our own people and our own market. And one of the ways we figuring out to do that is to actually meet them halfway, and whether that is in education, through providing or sourcing coffees that more accessible to the larger public, but that doesn't limit us in any way to the coffees that we really want to source. So you would normally find that we try to cater to a range of needs, because there's also times when we are coffee geeks, so there's not always be times when we want to find a really special coffee, and not necessarily special because of how much it costs, but just like something that's so unique, whether it be a new region that we try out for the first time, or an interesting processing method. I think we just want to be a space where people feel that they can hop on, learn something interesting about coffee, and kind of feel a bit invested in this coffee community. We also see Cedar as also just a brand, not just coffee, but a bigger brand, something that that has more connection than just coffee. And I think we have a lot of plans and projects that is not coffee related, but very fun and engaging. I don't think we should start saying exactly what those projects are, but we do know that there's a lot of ideas and projects that we want to do, but we need to make sure that can be done.
Yeah, I think we want more people to drink better coffee. And if that means getting someone from drinking instant coffee to, your entry-level specialty coffee, or get someone from drinking your entry-level specialty to something that's, 89, 90 scoring coffee, we want to do that. And I think to add on to what Leigh is saying, we're not only going to be focused on using coffee to get people to drink better coffee.
We'll have to have another episode at some point where you guys will tell us about all these other projects. But I'm interested just to go back a little bit to one of the things, I can't remember which one of you said it, but this idea of, building a coffee brand that's really seen as a roasting business first and foremost. Because as you were saying that, I was thinking about, again, I'm very proud to work with what I consider to be the heavyweights of specialty coffee of South Africa, many of whom are world class. But for almost everyone, if not all of them, their cafe spaces are a huge integral part of their brand, right? And I would even go so far as to say that because you guys specifically talked about speaking to the local communities, for the locals, I would say that those brands almost are one and the same as their cafes, right? You talk about truth, you talk about origin, you talk about tribe. For so many Cape Townians, those brands are the cafe spaces, not really the roasting businesses, right? So how do you think you reconcile those two ambitions, the ambition to speak to the local community and educate, but also to be more of a roasting brand than a cafe brand?
I apologize to anyone that might think that by mentioning mine and Leigh's age, I'm alluding to the fact that everyone else is old. But so that's the interesting thing, right? I think that's where we extremely privileged, where I think the cafe space was an integral part to building these brands, because the brands all started off new and fresh. Whereas as much as Cedar is a very new brand, Leigh and I, in terms of the Cape Town coffee scene, have been around for quite a long time. And I think that sets us up in a very unique position. But I mean, everybody's on their phones. I think people are consuming content a lot differently. More people are drinking coffee at home. I don't think coffee experiences are limited to the cafe space specifically. And I think Leigh and I were very conscious about that when we started conceptualizing Cedar and our approach for the first 1 to 3 years, where we wanted to take an approach where we don't have a cafe space. We don't want to be dependent on a cafe space to have to build the brand, to bring people into the brand. And that's where the conversation started around, like, well, if we don't have a cafe, what else can we do to bring people in? And I think it's easy for me to say that social media and marketing, let's get ourselves out there. But like Leigh said, we've got a few interesting concepts to kind of bring people in to be part of the brand, whether that's because we don't believe that needs to happen through people walking into our shop and buying a cup of coffee and being like, oh, cool, this is Cedar. I taste it and I can now relate to what Cedar is and who Cedar is. And so I think as much as we want to get our coffee into people's hands and get them to taste it, that's definitely the primary way to experience what Cedar is about. But if there's a second or third door that we can get people to see what Cedar is about, the goal is to get them through a different door but still consume the coffee. And I think that's through, obviously, online content and through culture, through using different industries and partnering with different industries to get our coffee into the hands of people that aren't necessarily there for the coffee. And that's where our strategy is coming in, where, and I think it's in simple things, like, again, I mentioned how privileged we are. It's like owning a roastery but not owning a roaster. And I mean, we're doing a bit of a build out in our space at the moment, which is making it a bit more appealing and functional. But everyone walks in and says, oh, this is Cedar, it's so good to be here, where's the roaster? And we're like, we don't have a roaster. They're like, but you're a roastery. And we're like, well, you don't need to own a roaster to run a coffee roastery. So I don't think that completely answers your question, and I'll hand it over to Leigh just to finish that off. But I think because we're so new, it's really hard to answer the question in black and white. But in our conceptualization of the brand and the way that we want to take the business forward, the first thing we said is we don't want to open a cafe. So the next question was, cool, how do we do this without opening a cafe? And we came to the conclusion after putting our heads together and heads with a few other people that there are actually a lot of ways to build this coffee brand without having that cafe space per se. Because we can create that cafe space anywhere. It doesn't have to be in a brick and mortar space.
I think there's enough cafes out there where we focus also heavily on wholesale, and I mean it's just as good as us putting our coffee in someone else's cafe, and I mean that helps both parties, and our job is to then make sure that they or our clients are actually representing the coffee as best as they can. So I feel like we have more of an impact supplying other cafes that's looking for coffee suppliers than actually having to actually put in the effort and have a cafe, because then it's definitely a different project, and I don't think we would have that flexibility that we have right now. So we're young and we have one thing that we're focusing on, which is the product, and then everything else becomes exciting projects that we could do with so many businesses, even if it's not even remotely close to consuming any beverage. And I think that's the exciting thing. I think of Square Mile in London. I mean, they are majority a roastery, and they've taken over all of London. Like whatever cafe you're in, you would see Square Mile there. But I don't think they have a cafe, to my knowledge. I think it's just a roastery. Maybe they do now. I don't know.
It's not what they're known for at any rate, right? They're not known for their cafe. They're known for their brand and for their coffee.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the times we always tend to look overseas for concepts and try to apply it here. So, and that's been very helpful, especially with even the roaster, not owning a roaster, because at the same time we do not have the luxury to afford a full roaster at this time. So we need to also make decisions based on what we can afford and how we want to go about this to make it functional for us. So we're not even a year in, so we've just been making it as practical as we can with a focus on keeping it simple. Our job is to sell coffee. Right now it's to sell coffee and have our product be surrounded by good training, good services, and as much education as we have, because we want to actually share our experiences with all our customers, and that includes our clients. So I think that is how we are, or our plan of action going forward. But I'm sure further down the line, we all have that feeling of maybe just like a small espresso bar just to showcase our coffee. But at the same time, we also love doing pop-ups. And it was amazing to actually be in Cape Coffee Beans and just run coffee for like a few hours. Like that's what we excited about, because people get excited when they hear of events and pop-ups. And it's very popular in the food industry. You know, people's having the pop-up in a wine bar. So people just come drink wine and experience the cuisine. So why not apply that to the coffee industry?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And we did have a lot of fun having you guys around recently. And I think it's kind of worth just mentioning and spelling out for some of the guys listening. I mean, some people will know this, but others may not, that what you guys are describing is a lot more common in other countries, right? In more established specialty coffee markets. There are a lot of coffee brands and coffee businesses that are exclusively focused on roasting with no cafe. And that's a lot more common. And also the model that you guys are following of renting time on a roaster instead of owning a roaster is also much more common in Europe, as I understand it, and possibly in the US as well. So I like that idea that you're bringing some of the concepts of how these businesses work in other countries here, because admittedly, South Africa is a bit of a strange market in that way, right? Because, you know, so many of these brands are roasting businesses and cafes, but they're kind of running restaurants as well and training schools and all these other things. And that's what maybe they had to do as they got set up to make it work. But it's definitely interesting to think about different flavors of coffee businesses emerging in this market as part of this kind of next generation of specialty coffee businesses. So that's exciting. I wonder if we can turn our attention to your coffee a little bit as well. So we don't need to get into too much of the detail, but I'd love to hear you guys just talk about how you think about sourcing, selecting, roasting your coffees. You know, what is the Cedar approach?
The way we go about it is to make sure that we are ticking a lot of boxes in terms of quality, firstly, and then we definitely want to showcase a range of regions, and there's going to be your popular regions, but right now we also working with local coffee suppliers at the moment, so Seven Oaks, Subways, and they've been doing an amazing job, and we feel that yes, there's going to be other roasteries within Cape Town, South Africa. And that's actually purchasing the same coffee, but but the way we roast our coffee is basically putting our identity on coffee. And I think that's what makes us different, because we know the types of coffee that we like, and we roast through that approach. And it's always been, whenever we roasting coffee, there needs to be balance within the product itself, and also trying to highlight that bean or that region. So if we know that Ethiopian coffees are quite light, floral, and juicy, we're not going to try to make it taste like a Brazilian coffee that's more bolder with some nutty notes. So it's about making sure that you doing justice to that region, to that coffee, but then at the same time making sure you roast in a way that balances out the product itself, and that's making sure that we're roasting coffee to maximize sweetness without any bitterness, and bringing out the complexity of what that coffee can showcase.
I think any roastery has, I think social media has made the world so small now, and especially with myself and Leigh being involved, both actually, Leigh being involved in barista competitions, we all have the dream of sourcing world-class coffees, not just from like an experimental coffee sense, but just we know the popular producers. I mean, nowadays, like you get followed by, if you work in coffee, you get followed by coffee producers, which is a weird thing to think about. But we're also aware of who's producing amazing coffees if we're following European, Asian, American roasters, or in the Middle East. And I think that was the beginning of the discussion. It's like, cool, where are we going to source coffee from? The possibilities are endless. But I think we quickly came down to earth and realized just how hard it is to source the coffees that a lot of the roasters that have been on your podcast source from. But because we are very serious and I think intentional about, it's an overplayed statement, but supporting local, we decided that, you know what, I think we first want to understand this business as a business, and the coffee is our primary product. We do believe that there are local importers who are doing a good job at sourcing coffees, although that means that we might be sharing the coffees that we sell with a few more roasters. Like Leigh said, we still have the opportunity to do our own interpretation of those coffees. So I think to start off with, we making use of local importers and not relying solely on them. But I think that's the way that we want to start, and we really want to understand the business, make sure that we can roast as good as possible, and then from there try and understand the logistical systems in bringing coffee directly from countries, making use of overseas importers and exporters to bring it in. But like I said in the beginning, we realize it's easier said than done. We're definitely not pushing the kind of volumes which allows us to do that. But more specifically on the coffees, we're working towards keeping the coffees as seasonal as possible. I think because of the logistical issues around the world, what you bought, coffees that you might have bought in season can very easily float between the lines of being out of season. We're only sourcing specialty coffee as well, because we're a specialty coffee roastery. And I think those are two things that we really want to focus on. And I mean, buying specialty coffee isn't as hard as what it used to be. But I think the next challenge for us is to try and ensure that it's seasonal. It's very tempting to buy coffees that are not seasonal. But because coffee is our one and only product, like we said, we don't have a cafe. We really want to make sure that it's the best of what we can serve. And through Leigh's roasting, it's the best interpretation of that product as well, which isn't an easy feat. I think in the last, what can I say, like year and 2 months, we've realized how hard it really is to roast and sell really good coffee. It's not an easy thing, and it's definitely easier said than done. It's one thing to be behind the bar and serve it, but it's another thing to source it, pay for it, get it here, and roast it really well. And I think because of that, we really don't want to kick into fifth gear before we need to. And by fifth gear, I mean, reach out to all those exporters, which we know, in my case, some of them personally, it's really tempting to try and do that. But again, we said we want to work smart and we really want to take our time. I think we're not in a rush to try and I think we really understand what it takes to get where, I'll mention Cape Town and the people that have been on your podcast, where Tribe, Truth, Rosetta, Origin, Coffee, the likes of Espresso Lab, they got to where they are because they've been operating for 7 to 10 years. And of course, Leigh and I, we're starting off in a different foot, but that doesn't mean that within a year, we're going to be able to source the coffees and have businesses and products that are on par with them. But we definitely want to try. It doesn't mean that we can't get there a little bit sooner, but we're definitely biding our time when it comes to what coffees we source, how we source it, when we source it. But for the most part now, it's just working with local importers, and building good relationships with them. Because I think as much as we have our ambitions to reach out to producers and reach out to individuals across our borders and bring in coffee, it might just be smarter to work with the people here because they're the professionals. And I think we realize that as much as we are professionals in making coffee and roasting coffee, we don't work in logistics. We don't work in trading and those things. And I think we want to lean on the people that know about that and do that for a living, to do it for us or with us.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And I mean, coffee is such a complex commodity, right? There are so many steps in the supply chain, and it does make sense for there to be specialization, right? And I think it makes sense that as this market matures, we're going to see more specialization. I mean, I guess Cape Coffee Beans in a way is also a manifestation of that same idea, right? That we're going to focus on retail and distribution rather than on roasting, cafe, and things like that. So I share that perspective, and I think that makes a lot of sense. For the guys listening, whenever they happen to be listening, I will also say that even the coffees that you guys have launched with have been really, really great. I'm in a fortunate position to taste a lot of really great coffees. It's one of the nice things about the job, but I thoroughly enjoyed your initial offering, and I'm looking forward to tasting the subsequent offerings. On that note, I think that we're coming to the time where we probably need to wrap up, and I have a question that I like to ask everybody towards the end of the podcast, and now I have two of you to ask it. So maybe I'll start with you, Leigh. What coffee are you drinking at home these days, and how are you brewing it?
So I'm actually drinking our Puente Natural. I know it's a favorite of yours.
It is.
And yeah, so a lot of the times we tend to drink coffee at the office. So I get to drink coffee here like some mornings and then on the weekends. So brewing it as I was fortunate enough, I was blessed by my past employees with a Mocha Master, which has been really cool. So I normally make a cup for me and my wife. And yeah, notes of strawberries and quite a nice dark chocolate finish. I think it's been really cool. I've been really enjoying it.
Yeah, I would say the El Puente Natural works particularly beautifully in batch brew. I've also got a Mocha Master at home, and I've enjoyed it that way. So that sounds like a good way to go. What about you, Winston?
I have two coffees in my little pantry at the moment. It's the El Puente washed and the decaf. I've always got a bag. I love that decaf, Faden. I tell you, as a pour over, I have it I can finally drink coffee in the evenings again, because it's a little luxury that I had to let go of it's like my capacity for drinking a certain amount of coffee per day has grown, but I've reached a time limit where I can consume that coffee. Barring barista competitions, I couldn't drink coffee after 6 because then I couldn't sleep at night. But I've never proactively gone out and bought decaf coffee before, because it's like, I'm not going to pay for a bag of decaf. But with Cedar now, we always have decaf on hand. And so I always make sure I have a bag of decaf so that in the evenings I can have coffee. If I get home from work and I've consumed too much coffee, I can rest assured that in the evenings, if I do feel like coffee flavor, because that's what it's about primarily, it's what it tastes like, not the caffeine, right, folks? I can indulge in a cup of coffee and make a very tasty pour over with that. But then also the El Puente washed, I think Leigh and I both just rotate between the coffees we have at home from the offering, and we've just switched from the previous crop to the fresh crop. Yeah, so I'm tasting that now, and I think that's quite a diverse single origin that we have, which to me leans towards, in some cases, a blend, especially with milk. And yeah, I think it's pretty tasty. Nicole loves it as well. So decaf Colombia and the El Puente washed. As a pour over, I've got an Aeropress as well. And that's mainly for when I travel and we stay over either at my folks or Nicole's folks. And then there's always one or two of the drip sachets just stored for a rainy day. Like if in case of emergencies, there's a drip sachet that we can just open up and use as well.
Emergency provisions. It's important. Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you both for being on the podcast, Winston being on the podcast the second time. And I do want to say that I'm very excited about Cedar, and it's great to have you guys on board. It is the first new coffee brand that we've brought on for a long time, and I think it's already been really well received. And I love your coffees, and I'm excited to be working with both of you again, because we obviously worked previously together in different capacities. So thank you very much for your time, and wishing you best of luck with everything that's going to come this year, the first full year for Cedar.
Thanks, Faden.
Thank you very much, Faden, Mr. G. We appreciate it. We appreciate you and Cape Coffee Beans.
I hope you enjoyed listening to that podcast as much as I enjoyed recording it. I am very excited about Cedar Coffee. I'm very excited about the range at the time of this recording, and I have no doubt that they will continue to add great stuff to it. I would encourage you to show Cedar Coffee Roasters some support. You can find all their coffees on the Cape Coffee Beans website at capecoffeebeans.co.za/collections/cedar, CEDAR. I will include that link in the show notes. Until next time, happy brewing.